This is again going to be a public session. Maybe I should say 2 words about myself. I'm Hans van Es from the LMU Munich. Couldn't be here yesterday and this morning due to other obligations, but I'm very happy that I'm here now. My own field is actually intellectual history of China and not related to this, but I'm part of the, in some way at least, of this whole project, and I'm very happy to be here now today. So we are slightly late. We can afford this because one speaker who is in the program couldn't come. We received news today that he's ill, so there are just 3 speakers and then some remarks by Selçuk Esembel, whom we heard in the last session. The first paper is going to be by Sören Urbanski. He's a historian of Russia and China in the modern era, specializing in imperial and racial entanglements, migration, infrastructure, and the history of borders. He joined the German Historical Institute in Washington in 2018, first as a research fellow in global and transnational history in Washington, D.C., and since 2021 as head of its Pacific Regional Office at UC Berkeley, a new institution founded by the GHI and by the Max Weber Foundation, the president of which I happen to be. We met 2 weeks ago at some institutional meetings in Rome, and I heard that Sören was ill afterwards with COVID. He recovered and is here with us today. Maybe some words about him. He taught Chinese and Russian history at the Universities of Munich and Freiburg, and he was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge, so well-traveled already. He's the author of Kolonialer Wettstreit, Russland, China, Japan and die Ostchinesische Eisenbahn, 2008. Then Beyond the Steppe Frontier, a history of the Sino-Russian border, which came out 2 years ago with Princeton University Press. And An den Ufern des Amur, die vergessene Welt zwischen China und Russland, last year Munich, CH Beck. And as I read, he's currently embarking on a new project that examines anti-Chinese sentiments in a global perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans van Es, for these kind words of introduction, and also thank you to Dominic and Janice and all the other project members and organizers for the invitation here to Göttingen. As a historian mostly of Russia, I should say, I feel honored to be invited to share some thoughts at a conference on China in a changing world order. And I will now embark on something I'm quite uncomfortable with, and that is sharing some very broad and perhaps also vague thoughts about the past and the present of Sino-Russian relations. Today, the relationship between Russia and China can be described as friends with benefits, or maybe as an axis of convenience. Why that is, I'm hoping to explore during the next 15 minutes or so. The relationship between the world's largest country and the world's most populous country is perhaps special in many ways. China and Russia became neighbors over 300 years ago. Today, they share a border of roughly 4,000 kilometers, and this border used to be much longer, that is over 12,000 kilometers until the early 20th century. But Russia is not only an important neighbor to China, it is also arguably one of the most important countries in China's recent history, as we've just heard from Bill Kirby, both in positive and in negative terms. Russia was the first European country to sign a treaty with China in 1689. Russia was also the first country to have a permanent presentation in Beijing beginning in 1727. Russians soon drank tea, and Russia had some of the world's best sinologists. Later, in the mid-19th century, and not so good, the Russian Empire took the most territory from the Qing Empire, in size as big as France and Germany combined. Russia was the first to give back its colony, Harbin, and the Manchurian railway concession. Soviet Russia helped to found the CCP by sending 2 representatives from the Comintern to Shanghai in 1921. Bill Kirby just mentioned this. And today, as he said, China has a Soviet DNA in its political system. Moscow helped the Chinese communists to gain power in the late 1940s and to industrialize the country in the 1950s. By then, Mao was Stalin's significant other, and the Soviet Union became China's big brother, and we will see that this has somewhat changed in recent time. I will come to that. On the other hand, the Soviet Union dragged China into the Korean War in 1950. And then a vicious border clash between the 2 countries in 1969, including tanks and artillery, was arguably the low point of their relationship in the 20th century. Ideological cracks had already occurred in the mid-1950s. Bill Kirby just mentioned it with the de-Stalinization of the in the USSR under Nikita Khrushchev and with Mao Zedong's ambition to become the leader of the communist camp. Normalization of relations happened during the very last years of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev traveled to Beijing to visit Deng Xiaoping in May 1989. The post-Soviet years can be characterized by bilateral relations that developed slowly from a constructive to a strategic partnership in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin and Jiang Zemin, with not much substance. Main issues at that time were the settlement of territorial disputes and the demarcation of the border. The Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation in 2001 was in many ways a reaction to Washington's unilateralism after the end of the Cold War. Looking back at 300 years of shared history in just 5 minutes must remain cursory. But what has become clear, I hope, is that the relationship was significant, both for China and Russia, and bumpy, with many ups and downs in the past. The current Chinese-Russian governments, both usually obsessed with history, actively avoid any historical moments of friction and misunderstanding to guarantee the stability of their current relationship. We can observe a substantial improvement and intensification of Russia-China relations since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 and Russia annexed Crimea 2 years later. Let me now move on to the current bilateral relations. And as a historian, I'm now entering difficult waters, as historians only are good at predicting the past, but not the present or even the future. And I will focus on 4 aspects: leadership, geopolitics, economy, and military affairs. Leadership. The current Sino-Russian relations are strongly shaped by the leaders, and similar perhaps only to the era of Mao and Stalin in that regard. The similarities of systems where leaders are authoritarian also encourage close ties between those leaders. Xi was consolidating his power in 2012 and 2013, just when Putin began his 3rd term as president. Both leaders opened paths to stay in presidency for an unlimited period of time by changing the constitution, 2018 in China and 2020 in Russia. And up until the pandemic, Xi and Putin met at least 5 times a year. And during these visits, you can see many examples of mutual support for their respective political ambitions and agendas. Putin's last visit to Beijing was in early February 2022, just for the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics. This was the first visit of a head of state to China since the beginning of the pandemic. So 2 years, no head of state had been to China. And during this very significant meeting, Xi and Putin signed a joint communiqué that describes the friendship between Russia and China as one that knows no borders. Moving on to geopolitics. Both leaders and their governments share similar political or geopolitical agendas. One central goal is the ending of US dominance in world politics in general. They see themselves in many ways on the same side in the struggle between authoritarian states and democracies. Just look at Putin's and Xi's joint statement in early February. Russia and China do not accept, quote, democratic standards, end of quote, set by the United States, it says in the statement. And according to the text, there is no blueprint for how to build a democracy, including those of Russia and China. And in Russia, or Russia in that sense, what is meant by this can be seen as the crackdown on the color revolutions in the post-Soviet Russian near abroad, such as the Euromaidan uprising in Kiev in late 2013 and early 2014, or as recent as the Kazakhstan riots in January this year. For China, obviously, it's a different fight. That is the fight against the democracies of Greater China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And obviously, it's very different, but it's in some way similar kind of way. Beijing and Moscow also agree on their respective spheres of influence. For Russia, it's post-Soviet Eurasia. I just mentioned the Kazakhstan riots in early 2022, and Beijing explicitly praised how Moscow put an end to them. And for China, it's obviously the Asia-Pacific region. And of course, there's more, but like I said, the central focal point. 3, economy. The volume of bilateral trade was $147 billion US dollars in 2021. That was a 36% increase compared to the previous year. There are great synergies between the national economies. Russia exports gas, oil, timber, fish, and so on. China sells machinery, textiles, chemical products, among other things, to Russia. During the 1950s, it was quite the opposite. So now Russia is increasingly a supplier of raw materials to China. Technologically speaking, Russia today can only compete in certain military niches, such as the sale and technology transfer of Russia's most advanced weapon systems, such as the surface-to-air missile system S-400 or the defense fighter Sukhoi 35. And there's a growing imbalance in the bilateral trade. The national economies of the PRC and the USSR were roughly equal in size in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, China's GDP is more than 10 times bigger than that of Russia. And for Russia, China is the biggest export market, much bigger, for instance, than Japan and South Korea combined. And by that, Russia can no longer rely on or switch to other countries in East Asia when it comes to foreign trade with Asian countries. Russia, in turn, only ranks 12 in the ranking of export destinations, behind Thailand and before Mexico. So China holds the long end of the economic stick in this relationship. And economically speaking, China is now the big brother in the game. Both China and Russia have much closer economic ties with the West than with the neighbor than with China with Russia and Russia with China. China's exports, for instance, to the UK and the EU are 10 times bigger than its exports to Russia. As I mentioned, many of the exports that Russia does to China these days are raw materials. And in particular, in moments of crisis, Russia increased energy supplies to China. Xi and Putin signed 2 major deals to supply China with Russian natural gas in 2014 and 2022. The 2014 deal is probably the biggest business deal in history, worth $400 billion US dollars. It was signed shortly after Russia annexed Crimea and when Putin traveled to Shanghai in May 2014. And when you look at the TV footage of that meeting, you will see that Putin never smiled in the TV pictures during the signing ceremony. Nevertheless, it is quite an impressive project in many ways. And the backbone of this deal is the so-called Power of Siberia pipeline, which runs 2,100 kilometers from the north of Lake Baikal to the Chinese border. And it was completed within 5 years' time. But even by the time gas from the 2022 deal that was just signed will flow through pipes to China, China will not depend on Russian gas as much as Europe depends on Russian gas today. Central Asia or Central Asian countries remain China's most significant natural gas suppliers, and there's many others in the world. And another point that is important to note here, Russia's pipeline systems are not interconnected. That is, Russian fossil fuels that it exports to Europe cannot be delivered to China that easily. This makes, of course, Moscow's negotiating position with China rather weak. The last point, the military aspect. In recent years, we have seen a new quality of Russian weapon sales to China. I just mentioned the S-400 and the Su-35 systems. There's also an increase in number and the quality of joint military exercises in the past years. We have strategic military maneuvers several times a year between those two countries. And there are also joint naval exercises since 2012 every year. This is a sign of the growing Chinese and Russian presence on the world's 7 seas. But details matter here. Joint naval exercises around Japan the last time they occurred in fall 2021 and during the years before. We have these joint naval exercises there because both countries have territorial disputes with Japan. But there is for instance, no Chinese involvement in the latest and in the previous Zapad 21 military exercises right in Western Russia or on the border with Belarus. So China is kind of staying away from Western countries, so to speak, when it comes to military exercises. And probably another important difference to Western treaty systems, there is no mutual defense obligations. There is no such thing as an Article 5 in any Russia-China agreement. And coming back to the February communiqué that was just signed between Xi and Putin, Russia reaffirms the one China policy with regards to Taiwan several times in this communiqué. But Ukraine does not appear a single time within this paper. China does not want to cede control of its relations with the West to Putin, is my interpretation of this. So in conclusion, can we say that Russia and China are friends with benefits, or are there strings attached? Well, to my opinion, it seems that China is increasingly enjoying spending time with Russia, but I'm not sure whether Russia is doing the same. And let me conclude with misappropriating a Churchill quote. Quote, Sino-Russian relations or Sino-Russian ties are never as strong as we fear and never as weak as we hope. End of quote. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you so much also for staying within the limits of time allotted to your talk. And thank you for this summary of Sino-Russian relations of two unequal brothers. I think we are going to have an interesting discussion about this afterwards, but I suggest that we move on to Maria Danilovic now, who is here at the University of Göttingen, is going to speak to us about China's BRI and Eastern Europe in Reload. This is a very timely subject. I think one could add Germany to Eastern Europe, actually, but the city of Duisburg is suffering a lot right now because of the break of the BRI. Maria Danilovic's main research areas are China's foreign policy and the implementation of China's BRI in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. She holds a PhD obtained for her thesis on China's foreign policy in Central Asia. Her background in Chinese studies allowed her, as part of her doctoral research, to conduct fieldwork in China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And prior to joining the University of Göttingen, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography. She was at the Swedish Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala, and a guest researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in 2019. And she has been co-developing a digital humanities platform for comprehensive analysis and mapping of China's Belt and Road Initiative. the floor is yours, and we look forward to your talk on the Silk Road Initiative.
Just with there, right?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Hans, for the introduction. Thanks again to the organizers for inviting me to this event, and thanks for everyone for your interest in this particular panel on Ukraine crisis and how it affects the world and so on and so forth. So also, I wanted to continue from what Soren just said. He said that usually historians prefer not to enter difficult waters, and I come from international relations sphere, so I will try to enter difficult waters right now, and we'll see what's going to happen out of that. Just don't blame me if you don't agree with what I'm going to say, but I think perhaps we'll have very interesting discussion afterwards. As you can see from the title, I'm going to focus on China's Belt and Road in Eastern Europe and reload, and why I use this word reload. Because what we see in some parts of in the eastern parts of this region now, it's the process of deep social change. And this process started 2 years ago in Belarus with the mass peaceful protests in this country, and now we also should remember that without the failure of the peace protests in Belarus, Russia couldn't use the territory of Belarus and enter Ukraine in February this year. So all of these points are very much interconnected. And I'm going to focus on the two cases of Belarus and Ukraine right now. And what I want to share today is my thoughts about how China reacts, what are China's stances on the revolution in Belarus and its aftermath, and on the other hand, on the current event, on the current Russia-Ukraine war, and what this can show us about China situating itself in the updating regional and even global context. And I will focus particularly on the Belt and Road Initiative, because it's quite obvious that now Belt and Road already has its polity imperative status in China, and Belt and Road in itself have these ideas of new updating international order. So implicitly, Belt and Road has this new world order message. So how I will try just to connect all of these things right now and share with you. And as I already mentioned, I will compare China's stances, official stances, also most widespread media stances, and a bit of academic stances on in the events in Belarus and on the current Russia-Ukrainian war. Oops, and I just stopped it, but I will. I think it will be a help, and I will just continue. I tried to test the hypothesis about now China is dealing with the change in especially dynamic context. In the case of Belarus, it was the sub-regional context coming to the regional one last year during the migration crisis on the Belarus-EU border. And for Ukraine, it's the regional crisis shifting to the interregional and global level. So my hypothesis was that China's reaction is still very much determined by China's current political imperatives and established perceptions of foreign countries and regions. And this may cause contradictions with China's need to effectively pursue its Belt and Road linked interests, which requires a more flexible and prompt reaction on the ground. So this is about my hypothesis. And also for this particular talk, I used text. I was methodologically, I was doing textual analysis of various texts, both official statements, text on the Chinese media, and also I was doing interviews with the Chinese scholars, especially on the Belarusian case. And yeah, let's just go to the point. So first, let's come to Belarus. And if I will present it to you in a very nutshell, the very essence of China-Belarus interaction before the mass protests, I would say that interaction between China and Belarus became discursively visible because of Belt and Road. Because China has chosen, the Chinese policymakers has chosen Belarus as this strong point, starting point for Belt and Road in Eastern Europe because of the so-called stability or predictability of the unchanging regime in this country for many years, as opposed to the turbulence in neighboring Ukraine. So Belarus was much more attractive in these terms. And on the other side of this dialogue, Belarusian regime was interested in obtaining from Belt and Road material and image benefits, becoming more visible on the international arena, and raising the country's role because of this, its more active participation in the updating IR system. But yet, after the mass protests in Belarus, which happened in 2020, and later during the very difficult aftermath of the protest last year, and which this situation which comes up to now, up to today, China's initial expectations about Belarus did not materialize, and the situation around Belarus as a strategic partner becomes less and less favorable and more complicated for the Chinese partners. So the question is what China is doing, what the Chinese partners are doing now. And if we look at, I'm already afraid of pushing this button, yeah. If we look at China's official discourses about Belarus mass protests in 2020, we can say that from the very first glance, everything was very much regime Lukashenko supportive and optimistic. Belarus, it was very typical rhetoric for China in such cases. Belarus has own development path, and China is opposing, of course, any external interference into domestic affairs of other countries. But at the same time, after the start of the protest, the situation was not very much clear. That's why there was a very interesting also position about China has always respected the choice of the Belarusian people. And here, this also can be seen as a discursive loophole to be employed further depending on the results of the outcomes of the mass protests in Belarus. And if you look very briefly at the depictions of the Belarusian crisis in Chinese media, and here I will be speaking briefly about the state media and state-sanctioned media, because these two are have most of the power on shaping the public opinion. And here we can see that it was very interesting because basically all of the media reports were following the state propaganda in Belarus at the time. So there were no footages of peaceful protests. And what you can see here on this particular picture is the pro-Lukashenko, pro-regime demonstrations, pro-regime supporters. So the overall message was the revolution in Belarus is going to fail because there are so many people who support the regime, and the protesters, they are doing bad things, they are doing damages, and nothing was said about the peaceful protests, and there are not so many people who support the opposition. So this picture constructed was quite special, and if we look at the same time the expert discussions which happened during these times, they were a bit of a different picture. There was quite an interesting combination of the reactive assessments, basically just repeating the official position about Belarus, and on the other hand, the proactive assessments. So the policy recommendations of how the Chinese government, how the Chinese policymakers, the Chinese businesses should act in terms of the change of the situation on the ground. And very much focus has been put on the external factors in Belarus, especially Russia and of course European Union, and how all of this influences Belarus, and of course Russian factor was put as the first one. And from all of this, why I'm telling you about this, because we can see from all this new realistic methodological perspective was dominating. And when you talk to the Chinese IR scholars on the ground, sometimes they also admit that this approach constricts research, and it makes us miss other important aspects, but still this is how the researchers see it. So this geopolitical and neorealistic vision was still dominating and was present in the expert assessments. And it was, again, quite interesting as for the prospects of further cooperation between them. Almost all of the scholars were quite optimistic, and when I conducted interview with various Chinese scholars who do their research on Belarus, this particular quote is quite illustrative, because the idea was, I will be telling about the very last sentence here. It doesn't matter who is going to rule in Belarus, but Belarus will need the friendly China and China with its big market. So actually, the idea of this regime and regime links, Lukashenko and Xi Jinping's and all of these things, it was not discussed at the time. So there was this ground for further change. And then, for the sake of comparison, very briefly, I will show you how the Chinese position changed during the two incidents, the aftermath of the Belarusian crisis: Ryanair flight incident in May last year, and then migration crisis in autumn. As for the Ryanair flight incident, the position was very much neutral, and the main message was the facts are not yet clear. We need further investigation, and we need to avoid further escalation of relations between Belarus and the West. So clear, short, nothing more. And at the same time, the media was broadcasting about the new Iron Curtain, which EU is putting between Belarus and Europe. And also there were also some very short, interesting descriptive reports of how the steps taken by the Belarusian regime as the response to the European sanctions can be in fact unfavorable for China's interests, implying foregone profit for China's businesses. For example, there were these messages about Lukashenko's rhetoric about threatening transit of German goods to China via Belarus. And experts were silent on this Ryanair flight incident. At this time, most of the assessments were about cultural cooperation, COVID incidents, and so on and so forth, but not the Ryanair flight, not this particular incident. So they were again waiting for the aftermath of all of this. They were very cautious about it. And about migration crisis, the position was much more clear. It was about it was very neutral and pro-dialogue, but the idea was that the crisis was not portrayed as the migration crisis, but as the refugee crisis. So again, it was basically repeating the Belarusian state propaganda. And at the same time, there was this idea of Chinese against unilateral sanctions, quite a general position. While in media, almost all of the talks were about geopolitics, which come from the migration crisis, about this Russia-Belarus union against the West, things like that. And at the same time, there were also, as you can see from this picture, reports on how the logistic links and the congestions of the border and so on and so forth, how they can be, how could they be not very favorable about China, but it was never pronounced. It was just in the air, but they were just descriptive short reports about it. And experts were here already. They were starting to speak about the instability, the reshaping regional security by the migration crisis, and the increasing overall uncertainty about it. And the result was the actions taken. And the 1st of January this year, there was this. Yeah, perfect. And the 1st of January this year, there was this special new logistic road, China-Russia, then St. Petersburg. You can see it from the picture. And then St. Petersburg, Mannheim via sea, bypassing Belarus for the first time. Because before that, more than 90% of all of the trains from China, trains with the Chinese goods, were going via Belarus. And then Ukraine happened, the Ukrainian war started, and this brought a very sharp change to the situation in Eastern Europe and beyond. And for China itself, prior to the war, Ukraine was not, as I already mentioned it, Ukraine was not a keynote for promoting Belt and Road in the region because of the uncertainty, turbulence, also the effects of the Crimea problem, and even some disagreements about the defense industry cooperation, which popped up recently. And when the war started, we can see how this is February, March, April, May. Just in a nutshell, so we can see how the position changed, the official reaction. First, everything was about consistency of China's position, with the references of China's position on the Crimea problem. So Russia has its own legitimate security concerns in its case with the Ukraine, and there should be peace talks of the parties involved, and there shouldn't be any unilateral sanctions against Russia. Then, and it was very interesting then, because that during the MFA briefings, when the spokespersons were asked about what about the attacks on civil facilities in Ukraine, how can you react to this, there was no reply at all. But later, when it was already obvious that the war is going to be long, China came up with its six-point initiative with the focus of the humanitarian action, of the humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But at the same time, in the focus of it was standing against the politicization of humanitarian issues. So basically, by doing this, the Chinese side started to instrumentalize the humanitarian issue itself, pointing more and more discursively against the hypocrisy of the West, who adds fuel to the fire of war and just make this war continue. And another argument is that later in April, the Chinese leader came with the global security strategy, the new one. It's quite interesting because it was during the Boao Forum, very general, not so much amplification on it. But if we come back to Belt and Road, we remember that Belt and Road is not about security. It's about security which comes out of the economic development. And here, this is the perhaps we can refer to this initiative as the complementation of Belt and Road, but in the security terms. And again, for media, Ukrainian crisis mostly in state-sanctioned media, it's everything about geopolitics, the US factor, West, and the new Cold War mentality. It's very much reproduced in the media right now. And another special special thing is almost all of the reports are favorable to Russia, so there is very much pro-Russian informational space. And the experts, some of them, of course, it's quite understandable because the situation is in change, usually follow the official line, but also there are debates of how what this war is. It is a new window of opportunity, or a potential, or what about the potential losses for the businesses, for example, for various Belt and Road stakeholders in this war. And I will just conclude with more questions, because now we are in these difficult waters, and questions just coming together with with attempts to answer the questions. So I would say that this brief comparison of the stances on the Ukraine-Belarusian crisis confirms my hypothesis about the Chinese reaction is determined by the established perceptions of foreign countries and dominating narratives. And in both cases, China is dealing with especially dynamic situations. I already explained this. But while pursuing a variety of its interests, and here Belt and Road-related interests are in the focus, China similarly tends to rely on the principle of just an idea that this principle, very well-known ancient principle of control of the situation without taking control of the situation without taking natural actions. And this approach is a very cautious, implies a very cautious and restrained reaction to any changes that do not directly affect China's core interests. And even though this approach has some flexibility in it, for example, this reference to the people choices in case of Belarus, or the need to investigate incidents in Bucha and other cities in Ukraine, still, this approach remains open for adjustment depending on the situation. China's dominating political imperatives and narratives still restrain this flexibility of the position, and this raises the question of whether such an approach may yet become a serious obstacle for China's effective further safe placement in the updated regional and world order. And later we can talk about the various Eastern European countries. If I still have half a minute, just.
Half a minute.
Good. The last question which I wanted to raise is that we have seen in the example of Belarus that in a smaller but a very speaking case of Belarus, for China, despite the positive strategic partnership, win-win Belt and Road, win-win cooperation package and all of these things, still China's interests matter most of all, and Belarus is a very good example of it. So thus, even though Belt and Road is still, and now very general idea of the global security strategy comes in a neoliberal package, in the idea of let's cooperate, let's just do this cooperative interaction with the outer world. On the ground, there are still also dominating neo-realistic and even geopolitical narratives, and this paradigm, the domination of this paradigm also raises questions whether China can effectively combine such different rhetoric about the power interest-focused vision and these massively advertised cooperative interaction with the outer world, and whether this with this special combination can make China's foreign policy initiatives less attractive or less trustworthy for its partners in Eastern Europe and beyond. And I'd like to stop here, and we'll very much appreciate your comments and questions at the end of this panel. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much. These were long 30 seconds in the end. But thank you very much for this interesting talk on, I think this is really a huge problem the world is currently facing and China is facing. And for me, the interesting question actually is this war in the interest of the Belt and Road Initiative or not? And but we are going to leave this for the discussion and move on now to Liu Kang, who is a professor of Chinese studies and director of Duke Program of Research on China at Duke University. We have heard his authoritative voice several times this afternoon already. He is elected member of Academia Europaea, the Academy of Europe since 2015, and the author of 12 books. He has published widely in scholarly journals in both English and Chinese. And in addition, he frequently contributes in the form of interviews, reviews to American and Chinese print media and the internet media on issues ranging from contemporary Chinese media and culture, globalization to Marxism and aesthetics. So today you talk about the Chinese version of American exceptionalism, as I've seen in your title, within the context of the pandemic and Russian invasion of Ukraine. The floor is yours.
So the accident averted, right? So this one is what? How should we move on? This?
Yes, this one is next.
Okay, all right, okay, great. Thank you very much, especially Dominic, for inviting me to Göttingen again. And thanks very much for the introduction. This is not a Chinese version of American exceptionalism. This is a Chinese version of exceptionalism. But I have to say, this is somehow inspired by American exceptionalism, right? Like the Chinese dream, what about Chinese dream? Somehow it's I wouldn't say a copycat of American dream, but you see the analogy there, right? I want to thank Dominique, for bringing me again to Göttingen to keep talking about this subject. Because actually 4 years ago, I came to Göttingen to have taught a course, a block seminar entitled Chinese Exceptionalism. But now 4 years later, I still want to think about this issue because I have done quite a bit in different, quite a disarray, different areas, media, Chinese media, pop culture, global perceptions of China, global public opinion about China, and so on and so forth. But over the years, I've really find a great interest in the study of the political ideology of the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. So this is my focus. So I'm going to talk about this again within the context of the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because I thought this is not simply a timely subject, but actually it gives me some kind of impetus, some kind of catalyst for me to continue thinking along the lines of this ideological debate or ideological warfare called Chinese exceptionalism. Why I say this, because this is my book title, supposedly Chinese exceptionalism from Mao to Xi. I was supposed to write this book 4 years ago. Still in the pipeline. Part of the reason is I see this whole political idea, I see Chinese exceptionalism as a political ideology. You have some list, Chinese exceptionalism under the rubrics of international politics. That's, as far as I know, most of the talks, academic talks, publications, media op-eds, talking about Chinese exceptionalism pretty much exclusively in the realm of international relations and international politics. Rather than working with my international politics colleagues, I would rather come back to my old field, the study of ideology, study of values, study of aesthetics even. So I would want to come to the point of Chinese exceptionalism as an ideology or value system. I thought I would like to explore the cultural, historical roots of Chinese exceptionalism. That's all in the book proposal, outlines and all that. Actually, that's in my seminar course taught 4 years ago. Then I would also want to tackle the issue of the implications, the Chinese exceptionalism, the implications for Xi Jinping's global strategy. And then move on to deal with the questions of sinocentrism, whether this is a new version, this Chinese version of ethnocentrism, the Chinese ethnocentrism. In view of this Samuel Huntington's post-Cold War argument of the clash of civilizations, whether or not this is kind of reconfiguration of this. Some people will say that kind of the resurgence of nationalism, right, populism and all that. And of course, the argument of the Fukuyama of the end of history. Those are all very academic, intellectual pursuit. I haven't really stopped thinking about this, I have to say. Over these years, I've been teaching and thinking. Not much writing, I have to say. Sorry about this. Mostly are talking, teaching with my students. Because I figure those things are kind of evolving. The political ideology, the Chinese Communist Party political ideology is evolving. It's a current affairs. So when I talked to Janice about my topic for this conference, thank you for inviting me, I thought I want to talk about Chinese exceptionalism and Chinese perception of the New World Order. That's the original title of my presentation. Then I think maybe this is a moment for a pause to think about the current wars. In my view, the current two wars going on in the world. The two wars, as I said, the Xi Jinping's war of zero COVID war, and Putin's Ukraine war. I think there's a certain simultaneity, certain parallels between the two wars. So I would want to take this as a kind of catalysm to study this kind of evolvement of the ideology, namely the Chinese exceptionalism. In the political theater today, I would somehow apply a certain ideological analysis derived largely from this kind of immanent critique, intrinsic to the Chinese ideology, the CCP Chinese ideology that is based on Marxism, Leninism, and then the Chinese versions. Here comes the Chinese exceptionalism, the Chinese versions. So what do we mean by Chinese exceptionalism? I have to say, with this limited scope of discussion, I would define Chinese exceptionalism under the CCP. as, first of all, Chinese Marxism, all right, namely Mao Zedong thought. That's the first phase of Chinese exceptionalism. Chinese Marxism, about cynthesization of Chinese Marxism, all right. That's the kind of Moscow Yan'an phase. And then during the PRC, early days of the PRC period, that was enshrined as the Mao Zedong thought, right? Mao Zedong 思想. So that's the first phase. The second phase of the Chinese exceptionalism, we have this socialism with Chinese characteristics and so on and so forth, this sort of rhetoric that are filled up with, the 改革开放, the reform and opening up era under Deng Xiaoping. But none of those Deng Xiaoping and these successors' ideas of Chinese exceptionalism rose up to the point of a parallel almost to Mao. I mean, parallel to Mao and almost to Marxism and Leninism. I mean, this is very important in Chinese political nomenclature. We have the highest attribute to Marxism and Leninism, and then the Chinese version is Mao Zedong thought. And the latest incarnation of the Chinese exceptionalism is not Deng Xiaoping thought, not Jiang Zemin thought, not Hu Jintao thought, but the Xi Jinping thought, right? So this is the ranking, this is a hierarchy. So those are the things I would like to discuss. I would like to engage in some kind of maybe post-Marxist or even French Marxist analysis of the ideology. I want to talk about this Louis Althusser's symptomatic reading and Louis Althusser's understanding of ideology, and of course Marx. And I would also somehow refer to Lacan, but I hope I would not say too much about those figures. Maybe kind of postmodern triad, right? I wouldn't really say too much. But I think those are really related to our understanding of Chinese Marxism, because those are kind of intrinsic. This even Marxism or French Marxism, Leninism, those are very much related. If we can somehow flesh out certain kind of internal or immanent critique from within, it may be very helpful. So that's something I want to see. I do have an argument. I don't really know this is it's an argument in the making or sort of conclusion. I would say we want to think about the global implications of these two wars, the Xi Jinping's zero COVID war and Putin's Ukrainian war. I would say this right now we have seen the new Cold War in full swing. It's a Cold War of words, values. Sometimes you may say this is Xi Jinping's war of reshaping the world order versus West war of resistance, reaction, competition to the Xi Jinping's efforts, right? There's sort of new alliances of the United States, NATO, EU, and the so-called Indo-Pacific, etc., etc. So finally, we see the rise of geopolitics vis-a-vis the globalization. Globalization somehow is declining inevitably, and we see the new round of geopolitical contests and confrontations. So this is what I would like to share with you guys. So I want to talk about the theatrics, ideology as a kind of theatrics, optics in the real-time events. So I want to touch briefly about the Xi Jinping's zero Cold War and Putin's Ukrainian war. Xi Jinping's war of COVID somehow coincided with Putin's war, especially over the last few weeks, last few months, particularly since the end of the Beijing Winter Olympics, when Xi Jinping and Putin declared the friendship with no limit. And immediately afterwards, Putin started to invade Ukraine. Almost at the same time, Xi Jinping started to issue this massive lockdown of the whole country again. Most affected cities were those mega cities like Shanghai. This is most recent development. And people would argue that there has tremendous damage to Chinese economy and also to the mind and the soul of the millions and millions of Chinese citizens across the whole country. It's estimated like about 400 million of the Chinese urban residents were having experienced some kind of lockdown. I mean, the most prominent ones would be the Shanghai, starting with, the early ones, that's Wuhan. Yeah, that's 2 years ago, Wuhan. Those are mega cities, over 10 million population. Wuhan was the first one. And followed by Xi'an. And now Shanghai, yeah. I think I have enough time. Yeah, I'm gonna finish pretty soon. So, the lockdown, I mean, the most recent lockdown is Shanghai. The story goes that the Shanghai just somehow released the lockdown a couple days ago. And the Shanghai government announced that as a government, we never issued a policy of lockdown. This is from the press conference of the government. It's like 2 or 3 days ago. The lockdown measure was taken voluntarily by the local community committees, resident committees. So this is kind of a ridiculous excuse, right? It's not us. We never asked you to lock down. So anyway, this shows this is simply a political campaign for legitimation vis-a-vis the public health policy to contain the pandemic. So I would say this is the most recent embodiment of this ideology at play. I would say this has a lot to do with Xi Jinping's zero COVID obsession. The draconian lockdown measures since 2020 and the Shanghai Spring of 2022. Shanghai Spring is still going on, right? There's no end. Shanghai Spring means, the 20 million Shanghai residents were still locked down somehow within their home to celebrate the spring. Virtually, right? You can't really see the real spring except through their laptops, their cell phones. So this is Xi Jinping's propaganda war for Putin's Ukrainian war. The Russian-Chinese friendship and cooperation of no limits, and China's massive pro-Russian propaganda media campaign against Western conspiracy. The conspiracy is very much behind this rhetoric of Chinese exceptionalism. And we see some of the manifestations over, even I would say, over the course of our conference. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, some kind of ideological analysis. If you use Althusser said ideology is a representation of the imaginary relationships of the individuals to the real conditions of existence. Those are kind of imaginary, not the real, but these somehow are close to the real. We never approach the real. We always want to say something imaginary. So that's I think this is a great definition of the ideology. So we want to engage in some kind of symptomatic reading, trying to decipher what a particular text is unable to say or repress because of its ideological conviction. Distinction between symptoms and repressed ideas, between manifest and latent content, between the disguise and the message disguise. I think a brilliant piece for us to understand the theatrics is Marx, the Accident Romain de Louis Bonaparte. This is very, very interesting, brilliant piece. I give you some example of my analysis. I'll use some of the most recent texts. One is about this very special kind of rhetoric, the building a commonwealth of humanity. This is what I would translate. but the official translation is called creating a community of shared future for mankind. So this is somewhat clumsy, but the Xi Jinping keeps telling that we want to build a shared future for the world. Now, here I have the two texts keep talking about the shared future. One is the text by Antony Blinken. You know, Blinken talked about the US-China relation. Blinken cited 3 times about the shared future. So Blinken said the actions that we take at home and with the countries worldwide will determine whether our shared vision of the future will be realized. This is about the Cold War manifesto. Then Blinken said, and harnessing those 2 key assets will compete with China to defend our interests and build our vision for the future. Number 2. Number 3, the second piece, or talking about it straight, the second piece of our strategy is aligning with our allies and partners to advance a shared vision for the future. You find immediate rebuttal, you know, the second day, this all happened last week, right? We find the Chinese Foreign Affairs spokesperson. Let me just quote him and analyze that, it will end, all right? This is by Wang Wenbin. You know, he said at the press conference, this is a rebuttal. I would read this Chinese versions and English translations, I would conduct sort of symptomatic reading, all right? Wang Wenbin said, peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, and freedom are the common values of humanity, all right? Democracy and human rights have historical, specific, and practical contexts. This is the second sentence. First sentence is common values. Second, it's a specific historical context. 3, countries can only explore suitable paths in light of national realities and people's needs. Number 4. Finally, Wang Wenbin said, there's no one-size-fits-all model. So, end of his English translation. The Chinese, he said, 和平发展、公平正义、民主自由是全人类共同价值. All right, that's first sentence. 民主人权都是历史的、具体的、现实的，只能从本国实际和人民需求出发，探求适合自己的发展道路。OK， 最后一句 ，the last one， 世界上没有放之四海而皆准的模式。Pay attention to the last one. Okay, so just a little bit analysis and wrap up. This is, I still quote English. Peace, development, equity, justice. Those are common values of humanity. So here, the spokesperson affirms the universal values, right? We shared values. The next sentence, he said, democracy and human rights have historical, specific, and practical contexts, and countries can only explore suitable paths in light of national realities and people's needs. This is what underscores Chinese exceptionalism. You know, we are so singular, we're so special. So, universal values denied, all right? Universal values denied. First confirmed, second sentence denied. The final sentence. This is very interesting. Okay, the English translation doesn't really ring much a bell. English translations, there's no one-size-fits-all model. This is a wrong translation. The correct translation should be, there is no universally applicable and viable truth derived from none other than Chairman Mao himself. He said, 马克思主义、列宁主义和共产主义是放之四海而皆准的普遍真理. You know, this should be translated as Marxism, Leninism, and communism are the universally applicable and viable truths. So finally, universal values again rejecting themselves. End of the story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Again, a long last minute, but interesting. And I have heard that the word geopolitics several times during this panel. I think it's interesting. In Germany, we didn't speak about geopolitics for a long time for obvious reasons, but it seems to be relevant today. So now we have comments by Selçuk Esimbel from Boğaziçi University. I don't need to introduce you because you have been introduced already during the last panel. As you like, we can give you the microphone then.
Thank you very much. I think that this afternoon, I mean, it's in a way, we're all, trying to describe the elephant in the room. I mean, something unprecedented has happened on February 24th, and we're trying to search for some kind of explanation. And all of us, in our own way, I think probably are very nervous about, where is all of this going to lead? I mean, is this going to lead, because nobody wants to say this, but is this going to lead to some, actual Third World War? As a clash, as a military clash, So it's a very difficult issue. It's a very difficult problem. And in each case, I think we see, with these very brilliant and, informative talks, we see a panorama, a kind of a panorama of the situation as it is right now. Obviously, yes, formally, Russia and China seem to have entered into a very, very strong relationship, a kind of a partnership. So you have at the formal level, the, if you will, pronouncements of governments, the Russian pronouncement, the Chinese supporting, Russia's cause, and of course, the declarations from Washington, D.C. We have the official pronouncements of this confrontation that's taking place. But I'd like to maybe try to sort of go down to a level of maybe perhaps searching in each one of your talks, kind of, is there a second level of reality which might, offer a kind of solution to the problem right now before it accelerates into a very, unthinkable global, confrontation? In other words, obviously government pronouncements, official ideology is not helping us, obviously, because, it's kind of sort of official rhetorics. My inspiration is going to come from the comment of a Japanese ambassador who was representing Japan in the Paris Peace Conference back after the end of World War I, Ambassador Ishii, and they were talking about what should be the stand of Japan in view of the final, negotiations about dismembering the Ottoman Empire, or, sort of the reparations that Germany had to pay, and, what was going on. I mean, sort of like the final sort of spoils of the allies. And he says to the other diplomats, he says, yes, there are global issues. He uses a term like universal. Yes, universal issues, behind this clash. And it can be easily explained in terms of, the rivalry between Great Britain and Germany and the respective allies. But he says, we come from a different region, and we should act on the sidelines. Saying something, pronouncements is one thing, but we should act on the sidelines and look at this situation as a European problem. So the big question that I have, I think, to all three, presentations is this a European problem, or is this a global problem? The Japanese ambassador back then said, it's a European problem. You know, Russia versus Britain, this and that and so on. And we have to be kind of like on the sidelines, even though we are part of the, peace conference. So that's one big question. I don't have the answer to that, but I really would like to sort of hear, is this a European problem? Or is it really a problem of the clash of values, universal systems that we're talking about, about democracy versus, authoritarianism? That's a rhetoric that it's immediately, kind of like dominated, I think, the global media. Is it really? Or is that just simply the discourse, So that's a question that I have in my mind. My second question that I have, sort of been inspired from your presentations is, I'm sorry, I didn't want to open up my laptop, but I have the, article there. Just right after the Ukraine crisis, we got an article from a member of the Academy of Social Science, actually in Shanghai, but he says in that article, this is my personal view. I don't represent the opinion of the Academy, and nor do I represent the opinion of the government, of course. It's just my personal view. And that article came right the day after, the Russian aggression. And it was something like saying, okay, we can understand the Russian side, we can blame, criticize NATO for too much expansionism and all that. But he says that this war is disastrous, and that therefore it would not be to China's interest to be embroiled ever more on the Russian side. You can kind of like, okay, look like you're the partner, but in reality, the argument was, and he's saying, I hope that people who are in a decision-making position might read my, article, and I don't know if it will help or not, but he says that it's not to the interest of China to stick to Russia's side, because China's interest is truly global, for its welfare, for its prosperity, for its popularity as a country, and Russia would just take it down. Now, this came from Shanghai, and I thought that was interesting, right the day after, the crisis itself. So I was wondering whether in China, government may say something, but, what about the top, elites, the top, CCP, if you will, influential figures and so on? Are they really so happy with this aggression? I mean, I suspect probably not. And that's a good thing if they're not happy. Maybe there might be a solution from the back door via also their, actual attitude towards Russia. So it's a very difficult situation. It's a very, nerve-wracking situation. So my impression somehow is that I just don't see, despite what Xi Jinping says and all that, I can't imagine China with all of its different interest groups, the economy and stability of the country. I assume that they would want to, preserve, that they'd be so happy about, what's going on right now. That's a big question mark in my mind. So is this a European war or is this global? And second, do we think that China is absolutely, supportive of Russia at all levels? I don't know. So I leave you with these questions.
Thank you for these interesting questions. Two wisdoms, one from Japan and the other one from China. We are a little bit far advanced in time now, but do we have a little bit more time than until 1915? Can we go on 10 minutes longer or so? Because I think it would be important to first have 3 answers to these 2 questions. And okay. Then one. Okay, no problem at all. And forget what I just said. And Before I utter more stupidities, I leave the word to the panel and to the answers that you may give to these questions.
Well, thank you, Selçuk, for this excellent comment. And these are indeed two very big questions, and I'm afraid I don't really have a ready answer for you, but I can just speak for, I would say it's still mostly a European war with global ramifications as of today, at least. I mean, this is obviously a fluid and changing situation. If you just look at the food security, welfare security, and the consequences it may have, beginning already now, but will become more visible in fall when the harvest is supposed to come in, and the storage, I forgot the name, the storage for the wheat and grain is attacked and also overflowing, and it's difficult to export these or bring the grain to the world market, so to speak. And just another idea, I mean, that it already has global ramifications. If you think at US involvement, militarily speaking, in Europe, and what that means for the ability of the United States to project power in the Pacific. Binding resources, military resources in Europe right now is not a good thing for Washington. It may be a good thing for Beijing, but this is just a speculation. But these are just two kind of developments where you can see the global consequences of this still contained war, so to speak, luckily contained war. As for the different opinions or second level of reality, as you called it in the beginning, which I really like, I think it's difficult for me to speak about China, but I can just say maybe briefly something on Russia. And there it certainly exists, this second level of reality, even among those who haven't left Russia. I mean, there's of course many people who leave Russia these days, and especially those who would be the authors of these articles in Russia. But there's also many people who stay, and it is interesting of what is not said sometimes. I'm still kind of, we had this with, I think, Professor Kirby mentioned it, that we should engage in an academic dialogue with Russia. We should not break up or kind of destroy all bridges, so to speak. And I'm actually I absolutely agree with it. And what I'm participating in is often meetings like this one, a hybrid format, meetings happening in Russia, where we as Western scholars still can participate. And for me, it's interesting to follow these discussions because they paint a very different level, very different picture of what you can see in Russian state media and what is officially uttered, so to speak, about this war. I leave it at that. Thank you so much for your comment.
Thanks, Selçuk, very much for your comments and questions. Perhaps you noticed in my talk, I was also tried to ask me the same question, and I was tried to very cautiously use the word of shifting. So it's shifting from the European to the global, and this move is, we can just perceive it right now. And also linking to the Professor Kang's presentation and his arguments, we also have this idea of the ideological idea projected by China that there are no common values, they are not world values. And what we can see in the Ukrainian case, again, we can see the values of the life of the person, so of the people, the individuals. So because of this value clash, it also comes to the world level, not only to mention, of course, the food security, all of the other. So it's kind of very difficult, multi-layered shift. And from my own perspective, we cannot say for sure, but this shift is just being felt. As scholars, sometimes we also we both should rely on arguments, facts, and very clear methodology. But on the other, we also have intuition, and it's also very important to combine the two. And for the second, of course, first my answer will be yes, for sure. In China, the policymakers and scholars and so on and so forth, they are not so much happy about what's happened in Ukraine. We had this discussion in Hamburg 2 weeks ago. We discussed this particular question with the Chinese scholars in Giga, and they were telling us that when the war started, a lot of the officials and the academics in the state research institutions said, "Is Putin crazy? Because this leads to nowhere." They couldn't understand why he did it. Yes, and just to end and to connect with Soren's presentation, why this is important for China, not only in terms of this value clash and the things which Professor Kantz mentioned, but also let's look at the China-Russia relations. They are not, yes, they are friends, but I tried to show it in the Belarusian case. Officially, you are friends, but in reality, you're just the Chinese partner. They start to make steps in other directions. And for example, for Russia, in China, also now the academics already start to understand that the effects of the war on Russia itself will add, for example, more effects in Central Asia. And Central Asia I would not here agree with Soren. Central Asia, Kazakhstan protests this year, it's all very much mattered to China, and China also had its turn. That's why OSCE, not OSCE, big pardon, the SCTO forces moved out from Kazakhstan so fast. So this is also the question, what's going to happen on the borders when the effects of the Russian war, for example, the migrants which from Central Asia, which work in Russia, they go back, and we can see already some moves, for example, in Tajikistan and so on and so forth. So, of course, this worries. Just a bit, very briefly, this worries Chinese partners, policymakers, businesses, so on and so forth, very much.
Thank you. I take Sedgwick's question as deliberately provocative. You want us to see what this means to us. This is a European war or it's a global war? I think at the two levels, both at the international relations, international politics level, this is a global war. And second, also at probably the intellectual and ideological level, this is also a global war. This is a global Cold War. This is my argument. I think we're very much into the throat of the Cold War, the new Cold War. Let me just go back to the first part of the international relations. We are at the kind of inflection point that we enter into a new era of the almost complete breakdown of the so-called post-Second World War order, the so-called rule-based order. That's why those people like Anthony Blinken and Joe Biden and all those people trying desperately to reaffirm the so-called rule-based order. There's a lot of ambiguities about the so-called rule-based order. Is this a rule-based order, the post-Second World War-based order, world order, or this is a kind of a continuation of this almost like 400 years of nation-state order based on 1648 Westphalia system, right? So that sort of a system. We see the rise of globalization. Everybody was in the euphoria, especially like Fukuyama, end of history talks. End of history. I think right now it's the end of the talks of the end of history talks, right? So we see the total breakdown of this nation-state world post-Second World War rule-based order, right? So that's the first sort of international politics or international geopolitics. Again, geopolitics versus globalization. We see pretty much the demise of the so-called globalization. Yeah. And the second level, this intellectual level, it's all the more European, global, and Chinese as well. We find this Chinese version, so-called Chinese exceptionalism, not simply Chinese version of American exceptionalism. It's more or less the Chinese version of the German plus Russian exceptionalism. Don't forget Marxism, Leninism. Don't forget where does Marxism, Leninism come from, right? Plus this Chinese. And of course, we don't want to forget Japan. Much of the translation of Marxist works, Leninist works, come from Japanese translations of their work. So Chinese exception. Chinese reception of Marxism and Leninism, first and foremost, come from Japan. So we never forget that. So in that level, I think this is completely global, not simply European, not simply Chinese. Thank you.
Thank you. This was the first round. There are some questions already. I mean, there's a question here. That was the first one. And then there was Elena Meyer-Clement. Then yeah. Maybe we have first round of 3 questions, and then you raise your hands again. I have seen who has already expressed the desire to ask questions. But we start with this question here on the screen. A question for Professor Liu. As Professor Kirby has mentioned, in 2018, students from Peking University they use Marxism to defend Shenzhen workers' rights. I think we all read about this. I haven't read the famous JSIC incident, but what kind of Marxism do you think CCP is holding? Don't you think its ideology is more like 19th century capitalism? So that's the first question. And then, Elena, I think you were...
I continue with the question? Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you very much for these 3 so different presentations that somehow still link together. It's very interesting. As Hans already mentioned, geopolitics is somehow in all the presentations. And so Søren, you were saying that, of course, China wants to end US dominance. Yes, we've all been saying this. And it seems to be true, but the more I hear it, the more I wonder, is it really? Because when we look at what China has to offer as an alternative, China is criticizing a lot US dominance, obviously, and is working towards containing it, at least in the Asian region. But beyond that, ending it, the US dominance is still the reference point, and I do not see much beyond the harsh criticism by the Chinese government, what they have to offer, except for referring to Chinese wisdom and some other very vague statements. So from my perspective, I think the war came too early for China. China isn't ready for this situation at the moment, and I was wondering how you see it.
Okay, so I'll continue with another question for Søren. Thank you for the presentations. And Søren, you reminded us about how the relationship between China and Russia has been upgraded and relabeled every 5 years or so since the breakdown of the Soviet Union, from constructive partnership to strategic partnership to... And now we're at friendship with no upper limits. So I was just wondering, were they just running out of nice words to say to each other? And does it really have any deeper meaning? We now, with hindsight, after the outbreak of the war, we tend to look at it as this blank check, as Bill Kirby called it. But was it really ever intended like that? Maybe the Russians took it that way, but I wonder, what's your take on this? And then a question for Professor Liu Kang. When we talk about exceptionalism, it would be good, I guess, to know what the rule is that the exception differentiates from. You know, when we talk about American exceptionalism, it's got to do with the rule-based order that you also call somewhat into question whether it was really that rule-based. That is exactly the definition of American exceptionalism, that they try to establish an international rule-based order with rules for everyone except for the US. Yeah? That is the very definition of American exceptionalism. But what is the rule that China is exceptional from, in your opinion? Is it really Marxism? Because I don't really see that happening elsewhere in the world. Or is it more like in the presentation of Maria, in her contribution just now on the panel, that China is trying to become a world leader without really leading and without really getting involved in the world's conflicts and keeping just its options open? I would rather tend in this direction, that this is the real exceptional thing about China's rise, yeah, in quotes.
Yeah, first round of answers.
Oh, no.
Oh, the first question.
Yeah, you got the first question. So, this works too. Yeah.
Right, okay. Marxism, what kind of Chinese Marxism that is? Well, Bill Kirby distinguished reading of Marx from Chinese versions of Marxism. I think that's a very important distinction. Those students were in trouble because they study Marx. I mean, Marx definitely is very different from Chinese versions of Marxism. So that's one thing. I think it's right. I mean, this question gives a very good answer already. It's this kind of Chinese version, new version, Xi Jinping's version of Marxism, Leninism. Maybe not. This is more or less like a revival of the 19th century. I would call geo-Darwinism. It's not a social Darwinism. It's a geo-Darwinism. It's more than a social. The law of the jungle. I mean, you talk about a rule-based. This is the law of the jungle. The social Darwinism transformed into geo-Darwinism in this new versions. I would just simply say this is a kind of populist, nationalist propaganda, or I would say this populist nationalist fervor. That is the backbone of the so-called Chinese exceptionalism. It's not really based on this law or this US-led, this so-called. What really distinguished this Chinese latest version of Chinese exceptionalism, in my view, this is a new version. This is maybe it's a Chinese exceptionalism 3.1. Okay, rather than the older version that we talked about 4 years ago when at Göttingen. So this is escalation of the new versions. It's more into this kind of nationalistic passions based on the narratives of the humiliation, 100 years of humiliation and the revenge and the might is right. All those kind of power-driven argument that somehow pushed for this pretty scary version of Chinese exceptionalism, right? I mean, the world is really shocked by this assertiveness of this Chinese exceptionalism. We are really exceptional. We hear at almost every corner. I mean, it's not simply Xi Jinping and his diplomats, but some academic diplomats as well, right? I mean, Bill Kirby referred to some brilliant academic diplomat at work. So this is the sort of discussion that's going on. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for these two excellent questions. They are somewhat related to each other, I think. And you see, that happens when you quickly write a talk and don't wait your words. I should have written maybe containment or, rather than, or challenge to the US order rather than end. So I would fully agree with you. And I would also agree that there is China has not yet developed an alternative model that it would be able to kind of project on the world if it would have the power to do so. From my reading, and I'm not an expert on Chinese contemporary foreign policy, there is like two topics that China pretty aggressively is kind of lobbying for on the world stage. Is Taiwan, one China policy, and human rights when it comes to internal rights in China, when it gets really aggressive on the world stage in terms of diplomacy, so to speak. But I cannot see any constructive role that China is playing now, even in this war. Of course, China abstained from the vote in the UN Security Council, and it is kind of, in terms of media representation of that war, backing Russia. But at the same time, it is not actively helping Russia, at least not that we can see it now, because China is freeing secondary sanctions, for instance, from the United States that would really hurt the Chinese economy, for instance. We don't know how this will develop. I just can say what we see now and what we can observe now. And that brings me to the second question, to Björn Oppermann's question is, I mean, of course, these are just phrases like constructive, then strategic, now friendship, and now without borders or limits. I don't know what comes next, above the clouds, or I don't know. So there's always, lots of creativity when it comes to these constructs or like phrases, so to speak. But I would still think that there is more substance to the Russia-China relationship than we have seen in the 1990s or even the 2000s since the last 10 years or so, due to the economic interdependence and mutual kind of interests when it comes to geopolitics, at least for the moment, which doesn't mean that this is for forever. I mean, we have seen how quickly bilateral relations between Russia and China have deteriorated in the past, and the same can happen once this access is not convenient for one of the sides anymore. So I hope that answers some of the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess Helena's question, right?
Yeah.
Because the last one was just more a comment than a question. I would first almost completely agree with your question, with how you put it. I would just only, perhaps one small remark, not too early. Perhaps for China, this war was in general and not beneficial at all. And even though I was focusing on Belt and Road today, even though in Belt and Road, for example, there are different various roads, sea roads, land roads, and so on, so on and so forth. But this particular war, with all of these implications which we have just talking about, this is a shock. And now there should be a reaction, and what I tried to present in my talk, the reaction is quite special and perhaps not very much effective. And just very last also comment to link to a question also. Perhaps I will sound a bit pessimistic. And today we were speaking about the Cold War and the historical analysis with the new Cold War. But perhaps I would look, I would rather compare it. And today we had it during the previous panel with the First World War, and then all of the outcome. We remember what happened after the First World War, the 1917 revolution, and all of the social change on this part of Eurasia, and all of the other changes in other countries. So I don't want to be pessimistic, but perhaps if make historical analogies, perhaps we are closer to that situation than just to the Cold War situation after that.
Okay.
Can I just briefly say something about historical analogies? And I would actually disagree with you, Professor Liu, about the new Cold War. I wish sometimes that we had the Cold War again, because the world was much less messy and in a way safer than it seems today. I don't know. I mean, this is just an observation from my side. I don't know. That's why I'm a little hesitant to use the new Cold War as a concept. I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, so would you like to react? Well, if you would like to respond, do it. I just learned we have some time, and I mean, other people are waiting for asking questions, but yes, please react.
Thank you, Soren. I guess we want to really have a clear understanding of what Cold War means, right? Otherwise, we get really messy. Everything is in disarray, I would say. You know, my mind is pretty much in chaos. So I don't want to drag everybody into this chaos again. So if we want to define Cold War in a very simple terms, the Cold War is basically war of words, war of propaganda, compounded by geopolitical interests, of course. You know, there's not simply a war of values. I mean, of course, we talk about communism versus free world. The United States is the leader of the free world, where the Soviet Union is the evil empire of communism, whatever. That's the predominant thesis for the Cold War, right? The Iron Curtain speech by Winston Churchill to start this Cold War. That's a kind of rhetorical precursor to the inaugural phase of a Cold War. So I think the Cold War, if we define Cold War very carefully within the realm of world of words, world of images, world of values, we are in, pretty clearly, we're in the first phase of Cold War. Maybe geographically, or geopolitically, we're not really, because there's no alliance, there's no new Warsaw Pact. There's no military organization, except there's a NATO and you're talking about the AUKUS and whatever. China was not ready. So in that phase, there's not really much like what happened in the real history of the Cold War era, right? So
This Cold War looks different than the other one, but there are some signs. I mean, so there were three hands raised. Okay, then you can just pass on, and I have seen you just in the back.
Sure, I have a quick question. Well, I have a quick question to Professor Liu Kang about the use of the term exceptionalism to describe Chinese foreign policy or Chinese foreign strategy in general. I think it's perhaps analytically easy to just think of something that is already there, and certainly there has already been a scholarly debate about in what way Chinese contemporary exceptionalism is how does it look like and how it differs from historical exceptionalism. My question is that is it really appropriate to use the term exceptionalism to refer to contemporary Chinese foreign strategy? And the reasoning behind it is that I don't think it is so much appropriate. I think the United States has one. It considers itself as the template for all societies that as long as you develop economy, you become liberal democracy. And the American is a shining beacon of that. I think Soviet Union has a exceptionalist strategy, ideology, that is as long as you let the class struggle take place, it'll eventually become communism, and Soviet Union is a shining beacon of that. I don't think Chinese state, contemporary Chinese state has such ideology. To me, Chinese rhetoric is very much negatively defined, that we are, Chinese is thinking itself as not as exception, but as the norm. And that has been consistently shown also in your analysis, that is trying to say that, look, Chinese model is not the best, it's a model that adapts to Chinese own condition. And is simply saying that China does not have to conform to Western model, and it has this model of its own, but it has no intention to say that this model can be exported to other states or is the best model. To me, that's not exceptionalist, but simply saying that it's normal. It's a normalization strategy.
Just pass on to your neighbor first.
I only have a very small and very specific question to Maria, and I hope I haven't missed it. You mentioned it in your talk. It was a long day after all. I mean, there were Chinese nationals present in Ukraine in the beginning, and they were at quite some risk. And I was wondering whether, first of all, how was this reflected in Chinese official statements and Chinese media? And there were also Chinese students among them, and were they able also to, using videos or whatever, to reach out into the Chinese public sphere and maybe get a message across that maybe may have differed from what you've presented us with in your statements. So I think that would be interesting to know.
Hi, first of all, thank you for your presentations. I don't really have a question, I think, maybe more of a comment. Because if you listen to Russian media nowadays, I think there's a lot of talk about, oh, we don't get technology from the West, and we get it from China. Everything's fine. We got China on our side, right? Of course, analysts see it a little more cautious, but there is this strong sense that China will help out. And I think in that sense, coming back to, I think Søren said it, that this relationship has changed where China is now the senior partner and Russia is the junior partner in a lot of senses, not in all, but in some. So I think that China has now also the longer stick in its hand when dealing with Russia. And I think that maybe something that people don't talk about enough is that China actually has a great opportunity to be an influencing factor in the war and to stop the war even, probably, if they would actually make any attempts to create peace between Ukraine and Russia, because they have great relations to both those countries. And I don't know how, but I just wonder, is there any attempt of influencing China to actually go that direction? Or is China just too busy internally with domestic issues to really be active in that regard? Or what, do you have any insights or any ideas about that?
Okay, these were 3 questions I've seen said. Was this directly a response to something? Because there are 2 more questions. I guess this would be a little bit too much for one round. And
Cold War definition.
okay, but I would like to then postpone your questions to the next.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. You need the microphone because the audience.
The Cold War, I'm afraid, was not just a war of words. It was also a divided Germany. It was also the Vietnam War and the repression of the Prague uprising and the Budapest uprising. So in other words, I wish it had remained at the level of just words, but it wasn't. So if geopolitics is coming back, are we also confronted with a new reality that if we're lucky, we're going to get contained wars, you know, sort of contained instead of all out? Because it seems as if, unfortunately, the alternative to, the end of globalization is not simply a new war of words. There's a clash here going on. So how contained is it going to be? Is the big, depressing problem.
Okay, thank you. I think we should answer the questions first, and then Janice, and there are 2 more questions here in the chat. So, okay. So it's your turn. I don't know who wants to start, but
maybe I talk too much, but I want to respond to the questions simultaneously about this norm and the question of the Cold War as a war of words. Right. This has a lot to do with the rule-based world order and the norms, right? The Chinese argument, I would say over the last 10 years or so, evolved into a more pronounced narrative of the victimization, of humiliation. And underlying that is the argument of the revenge. So I think that's a kind of it's kind of revival of this 19th century social Darwinism, and I would say geo-Darwinism. It's not social anymore. So, which has a lot to do, deeply rooted in this overarching, or shall we say the master narrative, or the meta-narrative for modernity, modernity seen from a Hegelian lens, the teleological lens, modernity towards development, toward progress. Those are ultimate values. And China somehow subscribed to these versions of progress, development. And you know that. This is Deng Xiaoping's famous saying, 发展就是硬道理. Yeah, the hardcore reason is development. That's almost a plagiarism directly from Friedrich Hegel, right? So this Hegelianism is dominant not simply our imagination of the world, modern world, or so-called modernity. It has become really the backbone of Chinese imagination or ideology of the world. So that's the norm. But the flip side of that argument is China somehow suffered from this modernity, this progress, this development because of the imperialism, because of the colonialism, and what have you. The Western powers were kind of more, if you think about the teleology, the Western powers are far more advanced than China in this kind of a teleological trajectory. So China is catching up, but China is beating up by these Western powers. The Western powers always conspire to block China, right? So that's why China has this very ambivalent attitudes towards so-called norms. I want to emphasize the word attitudes. The attitudes is not really rational calculation. It's a lot of emotional, kind of non-rational reactions, kind of feelings of humiliation. You know, this is a standard argument accepted by most Chinese, I would say. We suffered this We suffered 100 years of humiliation. This is a great time for a great national rejuvenation. This is all Xi Jinping's talk. It's extremely popular. And the Chinese population would love to hear that and reaffirm that. So this is not a rational calculation. This is not really based on a solid historical evidence. Well, you may argue, you have all these treaties and all that. But nevertheless, this is the kind of ideological kind of mobilization, I would say. War of words. Words matter. I mean, images, emotions matter. So that's how we feel very, very complicated when we think about the international politics, international relations, and political science, purely in terms of the rational choice, rational calculations. They're not. I mean, of course, South Korea. This Cold War is not simply war of words. This Cold War is hot war, simultaneous. China, by the way, was at the center of two hot wars, if you like. The Korean War and the Vietnam War. Now, that's not Cold War at all. China was very much in the center of the hot war within the Cold War, right? But we never forget those entanglement. We cannot really separate them. The entanglement of the war of words and war of guns. I mean, this applies to Mao. I mean, this is Mao's theory. Revolution, how we win revolution? By two wars. War of guns, a war of words.
Okay.
The question was about Ukraine and Chinese citizens in Ukraine. Yeah, just very briefly, I presented that China's position was quite very restrained and abstained, but the Chinese citizens were the only thing where China, with the Chinese side was acting rather fast when it was already known, obvious that the war is going to be long, and because as I already also mentioned it about the core interests. What concerns the Chinese citizens in Ukraine, this is closer to the core interests than anything else. So how it was described in media, quite interesting, because first the Chinese citizens were advised to put the Chinese flags on the vehicles and just so that the fighting sides can see that they are Chinese, they cannot be touched. But later there was another advice by the Chinese embassy: just take out these flags because the attitude of the Ukrainian side is not very positive. And there were also even some broadcasts about the Chinese citizen who was injured in Ukraine, just accidentally. And then, yeah, everyone was taken by buses to the Moldovan border, and then they were reported that successfully China conducted this operation of saving the Chinese citizens in Ukraine in March.
Oh, thank you. Just briefly to the two questions. I mean, we can certainly frame the Ukrainian war as a kind of proxy war. But I would say it's not limited to Cold War, that we had proxy wars in the past and will have them in the future. But there is obviously also differences due to comparing them to, let's say, Vietnam and Korea, the most prominent proxy wars of the Cold War. Because when we talk about Vietnam and Korea, these are, well, countries, like one country with two different groups that are supported by different parties. Whereas I would argue from a Ukraine point of view, Ukraine is an independent nation that is attacked by Russia. So it's a little different. One other difference to the Cold War is, and if I get the discussion right here, we are now talking of the early phase of the new Cold War. Let's put it that way. When we compare to the early phase of the old Cold War, so to speak, we would be now in probably 1948, right? As compared to, yeah, I don't know where we are in 2 years, but I don't know. But what I would like to say is, 1948, the world was in a much worse shape than the world is today, even after COVID and all the other crises that we have. We had like a war where 60 million people had died. I don't know, but and this was the kind of the seeding ground of this new conflict. So I think the position that we are in now, and we don't know where it's evolving into, is quite different, which doesn't mean that the outcome has to be quite different. China's position or China's stake in ending the war, the current war between Russia and the Ukraine, I don't know. I mean, there were all kinds of suggestions. Israel, Turkey. Turkey actually made an active attempt, even the Vatican. And China would certainly be one of the countries. I was just thinking when you asked the question, and it's a good question, who would be the most upset if China would actually be the negotiator or facilitator of negotiations, so to speak? And I think it would definitely be the US. But it's just a guess.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions here and two more in the chat. So maybe we start with the questions from the room and yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for your talks. I was quite inspired actually by Liu Kang's ending, where you showed to us within this speech that the narrative changed from affirmation and then to rejection, back and forth a couple of times. And I like that because you focused on the narrative instead of the terms, right? If we had approached the same speech only looking at the terms, we might have gone away with a different conclusion than looking at the narrative. And in the end, I wonder, after confirming and then rejecting, confirming, rejecting, we arrive at zero, right? Nothing has been said. And not quite that, but what does this narrative actually do? Obviously, we don't arrive at nothing, but it provides multiple opportunities for somebody to do whatever they want with the same speech. And so there, what I actually like to address my question, however, to Søren and Maria, because terms and narratives, of course, are also something you've come across. And especially, I think the term of Nazi was something that I found very, fascinating in the most negative sense, how this has been removed completely from the previous semantic field it had covered in this debate, especially around, justification of attacking Ukraine. So how have you come across the power of terminology and changing terminologies upside down, and maybe the same with narratives? What narratives have you come across that have either created an extreme version or have come to say nothing at all anymore because it's been so extreme that it has canceled out itself in a way? So that would be my question.
Okay, then Janice.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. Very thought-provoking, so that left me with a lot of thought. But I have a brief question for Maria. So if I understood it correctly, that there is a sort of narrative, which is sort of related to Emily's question, about humanitarian support and how these sorts of conflicts and protests and wars are framed in sort of in the language of we will do what our part is doing humanitarian support, which is something I also encountered when Ukraine is discussed in Korea, for example. And I'm just thinking if this sort of a narrative of humanitarian support is an easy way for countries that don't want to enter difficult waters to sort of claim some sort of neutrality. So that's my question.
Okay, now we have two questions, one to Liu Kang, one to Maria, and I suggest that we take the last question here for Søren, because the first question which we have in the chat is for all the panelists, and we can do that in the next round. But this is a question that is interesting, assuming that the war in the Ukraine in combination with the sanctions turn into a complete disaster for Russia. Wouldn't that also create an excellent opportunity for the Chinese government to make a weak Russia economically and politically very dependent on China, create the opportunity for Chinese companies to invade the Russian economy and start expanding its own sphere of influence by integrating countries that were formerly the Russian sphere of influence? Yesterday evening, I spent with Russian scholars who left Russia and who are associated with the German Historical Institute in Moscow. They are in several cities in Germany right now, and one of them gave a positive answer to this question, but I would like to know your opinion as well, and maybe we could start the round again with Liu Kang, and an answer to the question just asked.
I'll be very, very brief because I think I talked really too much. Yeah, I guess it's valuable to engage in kind of ideological analysis or symptomatic reading. This is what I would call. You read the message that is not there, but you find there's kind of underlying inconsistencies. You know, they confirm and they deny and they reject and they confirm again. Those sort of hidden, latent messages that we usually associated with the Soviet era. I mean, there's a very prosperous field. It's called Moscology, right? Moscology studies the decoding, the cryptology. It decode the cryptical codes of the Soviet propaganda. And same applies to PRC. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of dedicated scholars just trying to figure out what exactly is meant in the lineup of the headlines of the People's Daily and the headlines of the CCTV nightly news. Those are valuable studies. I think we never want to give that up. Even we want to deal with hardcore issues, the wars, the war of guns, the tanks, missiles. But don't forget that, behind that, on top of that, and in between, there were war of words, war of images. You cannot really separate them. So that's my point. Okay, thank you.
Maria?
Thanks, Emily and Janice, for your questions. I would link both of them in answer because actually Janice took the answer to Emily's question out of my tongue because I really wanted to speak about humanitarian theme. It is indeed very important. The narrative of this humanitarian, not aid, but humanitarian assistance, it is indeed quite special. And on the one hand, yes, as Janice, you said, I completely agree with you. It's kind of a loophole for those countries which do not want to be involved in the conflict, but which it is good to have the facts provided. Look, we had this financial humanitarian assistance to this country, so we were good. And it doesn't matter what's going the outcome of this be, who is going to win, for example. Yeah, but we did something to help people. But on the other hand, and I mentioned it in my presentation, it was quite interesting for the Chinese narrative because it's also instrumentalization. It's linking the humanitarian aid, the aid to concrete people who are suffering from this conflict, with this big narrative of the West is bad and that this is the West who creating who make these people suffer, but not talking about what we can do to end it. So this is quite special in this case.
Thank you. Allow me to answer actually one of the questions as well.
Yeah, of course.
So I liked the question very much about fascism and then the new meaning or how it is being used and abused, so to speak. I think, and this is like a total inner Russian, like Soviet, post-Soviet discourse now, completely unrelated to China, so I hope you forgive me for that. What I think this war, Russia's invasion into Ukraine is significant for the post-Soviet space is that something is happening in Ukraine now that had happened already in the, let's say, 90s and 2000s in states like the Baltic states before. Because like in Russia, you have a mix, an ideological eclecticism of Soviet elements, Russian imperial elements, and orthodoxy. And nothing or few of these things you could find in Ukraine after 1991, but what you had and what Russia and Ukraine had in common until February 24th is the memory of World War II. Although it was slightly differently commemorated, what you see now is that Ukraine is taking down Soviet tanks from the monuments, disabling them, not just taking down Lenin statues, but also Soviet tanks, precisely because it is now being framed in Russian media as the fascist and Nazi regime. So it is actually disentangling itself from a Russian from the common Soviet commemoration of World War II, which is actually one of the strongest binding elements of the whole Soviet Union. And this is quite significant, I think, for the conflict in the long run, because I mean, when we compare the situation to 2014, the eastern parts of Ukraine were very pro-Russian and very supportive. Now you have many Russian speakers clearly supporting Ukraine's position, and this is related to that. I mean, there's more reasons to it, but this is one important reason, I would say. And one last note, why this is being used in Russia internally, it's because it's so compelling. And I mean, people still remember, I mean, fascism, or the word fascist in a Soviet newspaper was everywhere until the the mid 1980s, because it was used repeatedly when talking about World War II, but also about other wars and conflicts. And Ukraine, of course, played an important element in it with Bandera and the resistance in World War II. So that's why it's so compelling, and that's why it's being used in Russian internal discourse. Now, to the other question by Hugo, sorry, I forgot the last name. I didn't put it down. Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't see it. Okay, Naminga. Okay, thank you. Yes and no. I mean, China clearly will benefit economically from this war, and will have a stronger economic position inside the post-Soviet space, so to speak. But it already has this strong position. If you look at Central Asia, I would say China's economic position in Central Asia and many of the Central Asian countries has been stronger than Russia's. What they did is that they divided their kind of tasks. Russia had like the military control, but China increasingly got an economic foothold in this. Interesting will be how this situation develops in Russia itself. And in that case, I would be less optimistic from a Chinese point of view, because if we look at Russian peripheries, and the Russian periphery, and by that I mean Eastern Siberia, Russian Far East, so the territories adjacent to China itself, they have already been economically weak for the last 30 years, and Russia has been quite unsuccessful in developing them. But Russia had been successful in keeping China out. And just to give you one example, it's not, because if you look at the economic ties for the most part are between the centers. That is between the central provinces of China and the European part of Russia, if you look at the economic output, so to speak. There was a different situation in the early 90s, but that was due to the breakdown of planned economy in the Russian Far East and the consequences. But it's a different picture now. And just to give you one example, I mentioned in my talk that they share a common border of 4,000 kilometers. 2,000 of them are by the Amur or Heilongjiang River. And only last year, a first bridge was opened across this river. That tells you a lot about how actually Russia wants to keep China out. Because China had built the fundamentals of the bridges until the middle of the river for a long time, and was waiting for Russia to complete them. So, and I would think that Russia is still moving in that direction to keep China economically in not such a strong position in its own territories, and China would accept that because the bilateral relations are more important than the local business for China.
Thank you. Very interesting. So we could now take the last question from the chat, which is the Taiwan question. Wen Jiajun asks, for some Chinese people, one reason they support Russia is because they see it as a pre-run of the possible military action towards Taiwan. And what do you think about this? Niall Ferguson recently argued that Putin's soldiers are fighting Xi Jinping's war in the Ukraine. I don't fully agree with this argument, but it's somewhat related to this position. And actually, if I don't see other questions, we are in the last round. Okay, I would like to take advantage of my own position here and make two brief remarks about Cold War. I was a little bit surprised that the word NATO wasn't mentioned when we talked about geopolitics, because I have been following these discussions about in China since the 90s, and this has always been an important topic, and I think it's something that brings Russia and China very much together, that there's a feeling of being threatened by NATO. There was in the 90s this discussion about the theater missile deployment system, which they wanted to put into Korea and to Poland, saying that it was directed against Iran, but Russia has always. So this is a point I think one should keep in mind. And the other thing is the economic war that has been started at the latest with Trump, and I think it's clearly there. You have seen the example of Huawei, which my kids told me that the Huawei telephone was better than the iPhone, and 2 weeks later, Huawei went down, and now it's a poor company. And there are several other examples. The chip industry, America is trying to prevent China from getting access to this technology because they fear China. And so there's something going on there, which is clearly an economic war that is taking place. So I would like you to reflect a little bit on this and to think about what does this actually mean about for the partnership of China and Russia. But there was another question here, and we have time for a third one. So,
thank you. I'll keep it very brief. I feel like it was mentioned at the introduction of this panel, but it hasn't really come up again, and that's sort of the looming food crisis that like the war of Ukraine is going to cause, and like a lot of countries have reacted to that already, and as far as I know, China to a certain extent as well. And I was just actually wondering if you know like how this is debated in China, in Chinese media, and what kind of effect you could see that could have.
okay, so who wants to start? Maybe we could start with Maria this time, and because she.
All right. So first, there was a question about Taiwan, and yeah. There was also a question about the ideas of all of the panelists. So I would hear from my side, I would say that yes, the Chinese side is learning from what Russia is doing. And for example, we can see that there is some of the advice to, for example, the Chinese wealthy citizens to have more, to withdraw from those who have the official governmental positions, not to have the big houses, villas, and so forth abroad, because this is an example of the sanctions against the Russian oligarchs, for example. And yes, the Chinese side, they are learning how, they are thinking about now how to react to these kind of sanctions if there will be the aggression against Taiwan. Because Taiwan, if you look at the Xi Jinping's rhetoric about how this is the core interest of China now, with the red line with the Taiwan, my opinion is that there were ideas of taking Taiwan back, but now because of Ukraine, perhaps this question is not so much in the air because of what China sees, what's happening. And also about NATO, about your question about NATO. Again, from my perspective, from what I have been focused on, there was mostly the US narrative, anti-US narrative in China, but not NATO, because NATO is almost equal to US in the China's perspective, the geopolitical perspective. Yeah. But at the same time, when the Chinese officials, Xi Jinping himself came with this new common security strategy, so for this specific formulation taking from the Russians of the late 90s about this inseparable security. So if one side is secure, each country should secure each other. So here there is this behind the scene there is NATO present, but it never pops up, you know, like in NATO narrative.
Okay.
Okay, good. Briefly to Taiwan, I think I would fully agree with what Maria just said. Maybe add that Taiwan is an island and Ukraine is a neighboring country, which makes the whole scenario from a military point of view very different. And although Ukraine had modernized its military significantly in the past few years, it's not comparable to Taiwan. So the stakes and the price would be much higher for China, which doesn't mean that it won't happen. But And it goes back to an earlier question. In that sense, the war in Ukraine is a global war because what you just mentioned, China is studying very much, and not just the Chinese government, but like even private persons are studying very much the reaction of the West. And therefore also the stakes of the West are very high in this conflict because it's not just about Ukraine. If, let's say, the West is weak, it will be an encouragement in a way, probably. But yeah. Briefly to the economic war between China and the US that has been ongoing since Trump and even earlier, and the fallout or the consequences for Russia. I mean, of course, there is an increasing economic cooperation and many things that are rejected in the West are actively used in Russia already today. And by this, I mean high technology, such as surveillance systems in Moscow. Actually, I think Moscow is now better surveyed than Beijing even. There's more cameras, there's more kind of, I don't know how the technical terms, but it's all Chinese equipment. So China is not, Russia is not reluctant to use this. And there's more examples to that. And the same goes for cars, phones, and whatnot. So there is less reluctance to use Chinese technology in Russia. I leave it at that.
Okay.
Thank you. I did mention your NATO and EU in my actually first slide. Yeah.
Okay.
This is
Sorry.
well, you know, this is a new Western alliance, if you like, under the rubrics or under this kind of umbrella term that we are launching a war of values against the Chinese ambition to reshape the world order in order to advance Chinese versions of authoritarianism. I'm just quoting not simply Blinken, but also Biden and also his predecessors, Donald Trump and Pompeo. They all have the same kind of rhetoric, right? Talking about China. You may argue that those is a kind of unprovoked. No. We always say the Ukraine war is unprovoked. It's a war of choice. But if you think about the very strong Western reactions, including NATO and EU, to China's recent assertion, you know, China is trying to claim a leadership role in the world order. It's not simply victim narrative. To back up this victim narrative, in the most recent years, Chinese propaganda machinery, I mean, President Xi has led this propaganda campaign, is saying that we, China, should take the lead. We should teach how the world should learn from China. I mean, including China's way of handling the COVID, right? So this raises a lot of alarms. So I would say this kind of give and take is not simply unprovoked. There's lots of provocation included. I mean, I play with media, so that's why I know my kind of a musical war talk will generate some kind of debates, right? So this is precisely what is happening, right? You have to say something sensational. Mm-hmm. This is we are in the area of the post-truth, right? Defined by the 2016 Oxford Dictionary as the word of the year, right? We're in the post-truth area in which none of these objective facts matter. What really matters is this appeal to our emotions, to our personal beliefs. This is the definition. This is exactly what happened. This is exactly what I mean, this new phase of the Cold War. All right, I will stop.
Okay. Has your question been answered?
I can try. It was about the food and grain, yes, and the Ukraine crisis. Yeah. So Ukraine, when I was mentioning Ukraine-China relations, after the Crimea problem issue popped up, grain exports, grain imports from Ukraine was one of the main themes of cooperation between China and Ukraine. So of course the Chinese side should react somehow. But from what I can see, again, the idea and narrative of food insecurity, it just comes together with the appeal to the peaceful talks between the sides, but not so much about the grain imports, because grain imports can come from somewhere else, and as soon as the Ukraine war hopefully stops, this is the soil, it will come again. This is not people. But even the food insecurity question is now started to be instrumentalized in China.
Thank you. Okay, so I have seen Dominic getting up, and I would first like to thank the panelists for their endurance and for their willingness to answer so many questions. It was a lively discussion. Thank you to the audience, and now, yeah, Dominic, it's yours.
Okay, just briefly an announcement. Tonight we're going to have dinner at the restaurant located at the historic Town Hall.